At 9:30 on the morning of May 1st, 1942, the air inside the converted mess hall of the battleship Yamato was thick with cigarette smoke and the oppressive weight of expectation. Anchored in the calm waters of Hashirajima in Japan's inland sea, the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, stood as a 72,000-ton cathedral of steel, the embodiment of Imperial Japan's naval pride and industrial strength. Yet on this particular morning, the ship's most dangerous weapon was not her colossal 18-inch guns, but a pair of ivory dice held loosely in the hand of Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki. Ugaki stood at the head of a massive table in the center of the room. Around him, nearly 20 admirals in crisp white uniforms crowded the table's edges. Rows of officers with thick binders stood behind them, watching every move with stiff precision. The table itself represented the Pacific Ocean. Wooden blocks stood for ships, fleets, and island air bases. They had gathered for a war game, a high-level simulation meant to test the grand operation Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed would break American naval power once and for all. The target was Midway, a coral atoll northwest of Hawaii, small on a map but immense in strategic value. Yamamoto's plan was breathtaking in scope and ambition. His idea was to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap near Midway, crush them in a decisive battle, and force the United States into a negotiated peace. A war game, in theory, was meant to test the plan's vulnerabilities, to expose unseen flaws before men and ships were committed for real. But this game had been predetermined. Ugaki, appointed as chief umpire, was both judge and an architect of the plan being tested. He had every incentive to ensure the plan appeared flawless. When the dice rolls predicted disaster, Ugaki simply changed the rules. To understand why a man of Ugaki's stature would manipulate a simulation, one must understand the intoxicating climate of Japan in May 1942. The country was in the grip of what historians would later call victory disease, a euphoric blindness bred by 6 months of uninterrupted success. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with astonishing speed. The British fortress at Singapore, believed impregnable, had fallen. Hong Kong, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had been overwhelmed. The Japanese carrier strike force had ranged over 1/3 of the globe without losing a single fleet carrier. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 dominated the skies like a phantom warrior, unmatched in maneuverability or range. Success had hardened into arrogance. The admirals aboard Yamato that day did not simply expect victory, they believed it inevitable. To them, America was wounded, demoralized, technologically inferior, and incapable of bold action. That mindset infused every moment of the war game. The simulation was designed to span 4 days of hypothetical operations, from diversionary attacks in the Aleutians to the final assault on Midway. But the junior officer assigned to command the American Red Forces refused to follow the script. Instead of waiting passively for the Japanese blow, he moved his carriers aggressively into a flanking position as American doctrine encouraged. When the Japanese launched their simulated strike on Midway, the American carriers counterattacked while the Japanese planes were away. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, acting as an umpire for that phase, rolled the dice to determine the effectiveness of the American assault. The outcome was catastrophic for Japan. 9 hits on Japanese carriers. According to the Japanese Navy's own damage tables, the carriers Akagi and Kaga were sunk. Soryu was heavily damaged. Nearly half of the Japanese carrier force was lost in the opening moves of the game. The mess hall went silent. This result undermined the entire operation. It suggested that the Japanese plan was dangerously flawed, vulnerable to surprise, and overly dependent on perfect timing and secrecy. Ugaki stared at the dice, then at the officers watching him. Finally, he declared the result impossible. He insisted that American pilots were too inexperienced, American bombers too inaccurate, and American commanders too timid to conduct such a bold move. He reduced the number of bomb hits from 9 to 3. Under his revised interpretation, Kaga was sunk, but Akagi continued the operation with trivial damage. The simulation resumed, but the farce grew more transparent. During a later phase involving hypothetical invasions of Fiji and New Caledonia, Kaga, the very carrier that had been sunk, mysteriously reappeared on the game board. The plan required 4 carriers, so Kaga was simply resurrected. No officer protested. To challenge the Wargame's integrity was to challenge the honor and judgment of the admirals and the very foundation of Japan's recent triumphs. This was not a test. It was theater, a ritual meant to confirm decisions already made. The confidence within Yamato's smoke-filled room rested on 3 fatal illusions. The first illusion was secrecy. Yamamoto's plan depended on surprise. Japanese intelligence believed the Americans had no idea where or when Japan would strike next. But the Japanese naval code, JN-25B, had been cracked. Thousands of miles away, in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptologic team were reading fragments of Japanese communications. They intercepted references to an operation against a location referred to as AF. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway, but Washington doubted him. To prove it, he ordered Midway to broadcast an unencrypted message reporting a malfunction in its water distillation plant and a shortage of fresh water. 2 days later, Japanese signals intelligence reported to Tokyo that AF is short of water. The trap had closed. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew the target, the timetable, and the composition of the Japanese fleet. The ambushers were about to be ambushed. The second illusion was Japan's estimate of American strength. Japanese intelligence believed the U.S. Navy had only 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. They believed this because, at Coral Sea, Japanese pilots had incorrectly reported sinking the carrier Yorktown alongside the Lexington. While Lexington was lost, Yorktown had survived, severely damaged but afloat. Instead of being written off, she limped back to Pearl Harbor. The third illusion was timing. The Japanese plan assumed that even if the Americans reacted, they would respond only after the attack on Midway began, giving Japan ample time to prepare for the decisive fleet engagement. But Nimitz, knowing Japan's intentions in advance, sent his carriers to sea before the Japanese fleet even reached its staging point.
On May 27th, the battered Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor. Naval engineers estimated that restoring her to fighting condition would require at least 3 months. Nimitz gave them 3 days. 1,400 workers swarmed the ship in heat exceeding 120 degrees, welding plates, replacing beams, rigging cables, and making emergency patches. Civilian workers literally remained aboard as the carrier sailed out. The ship was not fully repaired, but she could launch planes. Instead of 2 American carriers, Japan would face 3. When the Japanese carrier strike force approached Midway on June 4th, they believed they still held every advantage. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched his opening strike against the island, 108 aircraft. He also ordered reconnaissance flights to sweep the ocean to the east, just in case, but the search was poorly executed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone launched nearly half an hour late due to a faulty catapult. That delay would prove world-shattering. The strike on Midway inflicted damage but failed to neutralize the island's airbase. The strike leader requested a second attack. Nagumo hesitated, then ordered reserve planes, armed with torpedoes, to be rearmed with land attack bombs. Chaos erupted in the hangars. Torpedoes were rolled aside, bombs were brought out, and fuel hoses snaked across the decks. When the delayed scout plane finally radioed sighting enemy ships, Nagumo froze. Were there carriers? The report didn't say. He halted the rearming. Minutes passed. Finally, confirmation. An American carrier was present. Nagumo, flustered, reversed his own reversal, ordering the planes to be rearmed with torpedoes again. By 10 a.m., the Japanese carriers were floating bombs. Cramped hangars filled with loose ordnance, fueled aircraft, and volatile fumes. They were minutes away from launching a devastating strike. Those minutes would never come. The American attack was uncoordinated and scattered. The first who arrived were the torpedo bombers, obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators. To drop a torpedo, the pilot had to fly straight and low, directly into anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked first without fighter escort. They were slaughtered. All 15 planes were shot down. Only one man survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed and suffered similar fates. Out of 41 torpedo planes, only 6 made it back. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Their sacrifice, however, saved the battle. The torpedo bombers dragged every Japanese fighter down to sea level. They forced the carriers to maneuver violently, delaying their launch preparations. They turned the Japanese lookouts' eyes downward. At 10:20 a.m., Admiral Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers from Enterprise, was nearly out of fuel. Then he spotted the destroyer Arashi, speeding to rejoin the main fleet after attacking an American submarine. McCluskey followed her wake and found the Japanese carriers. Simultaneously, the Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived from another direction. By sheer luck and fate, 2 American strike groups reached the Japanese carriers at the exact moment the skies above them were undefended. At 10:22 a.m., the dive bombers peeled off. The Japanese never saw them coming. Kaga was struck first. Bomb after bomb smashed through her decks, igniting torpedoes and fuel tanks. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by a single bomb, yet that one bomb penetrated into the hangar and unleashed a chain reaction of explosions that doomed the ship. Soryu took 3 hits and erupted into a towering inferno. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were fatally ablaze. The source of Japan's early war dominance vanished in a single devastating moment. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, survived the initial attack and launched a counterstrike. Yamaguchi's planes found the Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs. American damage control teams, heroes of ingenuity and grit, managed to keep her afloat. When a second wave of Japanese planes arrived, they mistook the revived Yorktown for an undamaged carrier and struck again, delivering 2 torpedoes. This time, she could not be saved. The order to abandon ship was given, though she remained afloat for days before a Japanese submarine finally sank her. Late that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and ended her with 4 devastating hits. Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, dying with the wreckage of his last carrier. By dawn on June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were on the ocean floor. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators had been lost, including irreplaceable veterans whose skills had taken years to develop. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and a destroyer. Japan attempted to hide the scale of the disaster. Survivors were secluded in hospitals, forbidden from speaking of the battle. Official announcements claimed victory, but inside the halls of power, the truth was undeniable.
Japan's offensive strength had been crushed. The initiative in the Pacific had passed to the United States, whose industrial might was only beginning to awaken. As for Ugaki, he survived the war temporarily. His diary reveals a man grappling with the collapse of the empire he had helped build. When Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, Ugaki refused to accept it. He stripped the rank insignia from his uniform, climbed into a kamikaze aircraft, and led one final suicidal attack toward Okinawa. He vanished into the sea, the last admiral to die in World War II. Destroyed by the same rigid refusal to accept reality that had led him to override a pair of dice 3 years earlier. The war game on board the Yamato remains a haunting lesson in the peril of confirmation bias and institutional arrogance. Ugaki and the Japanese High Command wanted certainty. They wanted a world where their plans worked exactly as imagined, where the enemy played their assigned role, where victory was ordained by destiny. When the simulation revealed uncomfortable truths, that their carriers were vulnerable, that their reconnaissance was inadequate, that their timing was fragile, they rejected the evidence. They smothered the warning. But one cannot cheat physics. One cannot cheat an enemy who has broken your code. One cannot cheat history. The dice had been right all along. Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers rest in the cold darkness more than 17,000 feet beneath the waves northwest of Midway. Akagi lies upright, her bow torn away. Kaga lies upside down, her hull shattered. They are war graves now, silent, solemn reminders of the men who died there, and eternal monuments to a truth as old as war itself. The most dangerous moment in any plan is when its creators believe it cannot fail.